Sri Lanka's most powerful news brand.
In September 2015, 193 countries met at the UN to adopt new global goals. These 17 goals provide a roadmap that will help the world achieve sustainable development. But what exactly is sustainable development and how does it affect us? Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. But what does that mean? Everyone understands the need to grow their economies, but not everyone takes into account the negatives that unbalanced economic growth can have on the environment and on people's well-being. It's time to change that by looking at the world in a different way. The Sustainable Development Goals will help us to do that. Sustainable development is about the big picture. It's about improving the lives of everyone, everywhere, and achieving all these things together. But it's also about the details. That means we want economies to grow, companies to thrive, and people to have decent work. We want to create new, innovative technologies, but not by harming the environment. We want everyone to have access to nutritious food regardless of where they live. We want affordable and quality education for everybody, not just a few. We want freedom of speech, but we don't want that to mean violence. But how can we achieve all of this, and where do we even start? Well, the 17 goals will mean member states, alongside civil society stakeholders and major groups, will be working together for the next 15 years, looking at ways we can do business differently so that everyone gains. With these 17 global goals as our guide, we can achieve sustainable development and live in a world where people and planet benefit. But we have to act now. This is the time for global action.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to this special edition of In Focus. We're going to be talking about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. How much progress has Sri Lanka made since the SDGs came into effect on the 1st of January 2016? What does the future look like in implementing the goals? To talk about this and more, we're joined by the resident coordinator for the UN in Sri Lanka, Ms. Una Macaulay, and Ms. Ritsu Naken, the country representative of UNFPA. Ladies, thank you very much for coming on the show. I want to start by asking you, one of the main takeouts from the General Assembly was when President Sirisena was talking about developing a holistic national policy to implement the Sustainable Development Goals in Sri Lanka. We've seen some fanfare surrounding it. There have been events at the Presidential Secretariat talking about the dawn of a sustainable era. There's been the establishment of the Ministry of Sustainable Development, which has organized conferences involving various stakeholders. Beyond that, what concrete steps have been taken to make progress on these 17 goals?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having us on the show. I think the first thing to say would be that the President was quite right in saying that this needs a holistic approach, because the SDGs, unlike their predecessors or their little brother or sister, are holistic. The MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, really measured quantitatively how countries achieved certain objectives. Sri Lanka was a superstar. Given its income, GDP levels, given everything else, it achieved a huge amount against the MDGs, but that's not surprising in a country that has free education, free healthcare for its entire citizenry. But the SDGs actually are so much more complicated. Number one, there's 17 of them. But number two, they're all integrated. And you can't achieve one without looking at the indicators and other goals that need to be achieved across the entire range of SDGs. And what's more, they require a massive, massive effort at changing how Partnership for Development is done. So in that respect, absolutely right. This requires a holistic, all of government, all of civil society, all of UN approach, all of private sector approach, not just in Sri Lanka, but everywhere.
And since the General Assembly and its talk of a holistic national policy, we haven't seen a national policy document or an action plan as such. Has there been any progress on that front?
So I think that there hasn't been a national action plan on the SDGs, but there have been several policy frameworks that have been addressed in the context of the SDGs. So looking at local development plans for districts and provinces and seeing how they already match up to the SDGs and how they can be defined to match the SDGs. The 2025 vision took on board the SDG framework, and indeed the more elaborate document will talk more about how that vision matches the SDGs. The budget that was just announced last week was framed in the context of the blue-green SDGs and poverty reduction SDGs, the good governance SDGs. So, I mean, there is an increased expression by government that all policies are being linked to the SDG framework. Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, the water ministries, they're all talking now about the SDGs as part of their policy framework. There's an entire structure in Parliament designed to ensure that across government the SDGs are understood and the SDGs are integrated into lawmakers' thinking. So there's a lot of work going on. Has that been a major
problem, sort of enabling public officials, elected representatives, to sort of comprehend what exactly the SDGs are? Has that been a problem in Sri Lanka's case?
I don't think it's a problem. I think it's a challenge with an SDG agenda that's as huge as this one, with a government that has such an ambitious agenda. It's not a challenge. It's bringing those together so that there's coherence around the two. I think that the fact is that in defining now the legislation that will govern how SDGs are coordinated, there's been a great step forward in Sri Lanka, but the SDGs don't belong to any one ministry. And so you have the Ministry of Sustainable Development and Wildlife, you have National Planning, you have Census, you have line ministries. All of them own the SDGs as much as you and I do. So it really hasn't been a challenge. It's been a great privilege to try to make sure that Sri Lanka and the government and civil society and private sector understand the SDGs so that indeed Sri Lanka has that opportunity to move forward as quickly as possible. There are challenges naturally.
Ritsu, I'd like to bring you in on the conversation to talk about, can you enlighten us a little bit on the work that UNFPA and other agencies have been doing already in Sri Lanka, steps that have been taken proactively to sort of implement the SDGs?
Sure. The UN system has been embracing the comprehensive approach that the SDGs can offer from the very beginning. As Una mentioned, that all goals are interlinked. And that practically means within the system that we all have to work in coherence and in partnership. So I believe that since the SDGs was adopted, the country team came much closer together and look at the same vision, the same, the no one leave behind kind of approach, so that we are coherent in our interaction with the government, our partners, the civil society, private sector. So it really created a lot of impetus for us to be together. The other aspect I think we have really emphasized through the SDGs platform is the data and evidence. And as you may be aware, that the new UN Sustainable Development Framework has one big component for the data and evidence. So SDGs provides our focus on data and evidence so that we have evidence-based policies, evidence-based advocacies. So UN agencies, including UNFPA, have been working together to make sure that we use evidence as much as possible in our work, as well as help the government partners to use the evidence and data that is available to achieve this.
Are you positive about the response that you've had from the government? Has it been a positive response? Has it been enthusiastic?
I would say the government is very enthusiastic. Actually, they have committed to do the voluntary review next year. So we are already in conversation with the different ministries and particularly the Department of Census and Statistics to how we could help the reporting process. And it just shows how the government is excited about it and want to be visible in the international fora.
Thank you, Retsu. We're going for a short break. On the other side, we'll be talking about specific goals, including goals that are of key interest to the Sri Lankan populace. Welcome back to this special edition of In Focus. We're talking about the SDGs with Una Macaulay, the resident coordinator for the UN in Sri Lanka, and Retsuna Ken, country representative for UNFPA. I want to focus a little bit on some of the specific goals, which we're seeing as being very key to Sri Lanka right now. Through Newsfirst Gammad, the initiative, we've gone around the country, and the majority of the projects that we have been asked to implement have to do with water. There is a serious shortage of clean drinking water in many parts of the country, which is quite astounding given that Sri Lanka is a country with one of the highest concentrations of rivers, in respect of landmass. What sort of work has the UN been doing in this respect?
So I think we need to unpack that question a little bit. I think that water is probably the single biggest issue emerging for many countries in what we might call the developing world, where increasingly we're seeing climate change affecting water. We're seeing systems that perhaps haven't benefited from the type of modernization that would be needed to address a completely different population. If you think that the tank systems that Sri Lanka is incredibly blessed to have was designed for a largely rural population and it's an increasingly urban population. If you look at how urban areas build up around rivers, you inevitably start messing with ecosystems, and that's not unique to Sri Lanka. So I think water becomes a major issue. Climate change certainly is affecting water very dramatically, not just in Sri Lanka, but across the world. And we'll either have too much salt water and too little fresh water, or we'll start to see countries that have neither. But Sri Lanka has been, in a sense, a recipient of UN assistance when it was a poor country, when there was tsunami and conflict, etc., where UN was involved in programs with partners to actually bring water supplies to poor and affected families and communities. As the UN matures in a middle-income country, really most of the work that the UN does is around advocacy for systems. So currently the UN is looking, for example, at how to renovate and ensure the continuation of the tank systems and the cascade management of water for agricultural livelihoods, for livestock, and also to supply sources of water, but also looking at river management, river basin management, but also looking still at how in the most remote parts of the country where people don't have standing taps or don't have the type of toilet facilities that they would need to ensure that local water supplies are not polluted, continuing to find ways of advocating for those communities to get running water. We've also worked a lot in the last couple of years on ensuring the management of wastewater in large public installations like hospitals, and looking at water cleansing systems. But we also sit within a partnership with others, like the development banks, and in partnership with the government, and in partnership with private sector, yourselves, Rotary, others who work on a daily basis, be it on mega projects, mega policies, national policies, local policies, and local projects. But the UN's role changes. What we do acknowledge is that water remains a massive issue for Sri Lanka. But water is also one of Sri Lanka's major opportunities. The terrain that Sri Lanka has in its oceans is vastly bigger than the landmass of the island. And so water is also an opportunity for the country. And one of the SDGs is indeed about life underwater. And how does Sri Lanka capitalize on that? There will be, and there will come a time where Sri Lanka has to look at reverse osmosis and desalination of water. Population is relatively stable, but how population is spread across the country changes. But these are, again, coming back to interlinkages. This is interlinked with poverty, it's interlinked with services, it's interlinked with climate change, it's interlinked with cities and where people live. So all of these SDGs are really so intertwined. Sustainable solutions has to look holistically, as we discussed.
Ritu, perhaps you can give us a few examples of the advocacy work that the UN has undertaken thus far on goal number 6, which is water, and the other goals as well.
Okay, the water one, I'm not very sure, but in relation to goal 5, the gender one, which I'm more familiar with, we have been doing a lot of good advocacy work. And as you must be aware that there is certain paradox in terms of gender issues in Sri Lanka, that the high level of education achievement among women and girls not leading towards the high level of labor participation as well as political participation of women. So this is the area where we feel that we can do a lot of evidence-based advocacy. So for example, as part of the larger development partner forum, we have been discussing how we could support the female labor participation rate to increase. Another example is through the national forum. This is mainly with the national NGOs. More than 50 NGOs are part of this forum, and making sure that the gender-based violence will not continue to happen in Sri Lanka. So we have been doing a lot of advocacy work related to that. And this year's campaign will focus on the violence against women in elections. So that will also create a lot of discussion and good movements, hopefully.
Are you encouraged by the implementation of a quota for women in local government bodies and also now in provincial councils? Is that an encouraging step towards
I think so. I think so. And it is, of course, ideal world. You shouldn't need a quota. But as far as I know, that most of all the countries in the world who have reached a certain level of female participation, above 35 or so, needed to have a quota. So I think it's an important step forward.
Lisa, you spoke about gender equality and we've seen an evidence-based advocacy. We've seen studies that have said that, more inclusive, especially in terms of gender, more inclusive governance leads to stronger institutions, which we're talking about interlinkages, and we come to goal number 16. Just briefly, right now Sri Lanka is facing the Universal Periodic Review, where questions are being asked regarding the quality of institutions, about peace and justice. In terms of goal 16 and achieving that, so there's sort of a added motivation to work towards achieving goal 16 as well. What progress has been made, and how has the UN been working? What's the nature of the UN's work on goal 16?
I think the nature of the UN's work on Goal 16, again, cuts across the SDGs. Our goal is to strengthen government and governance centrally, locally, and at the lowest divisional level to achieve results for the least well-served or those who are left behind traditionally. And that involves talking to local governments about planning services, having the evidence around who are the population who need services, how do you plan them, how do you ensure the quality of those services locally as well as at the divisional level and at provincial level, and also talking through our different agencies to the line ministries on the services they provide. Governance is, it can be deconstructed to the smallest level and be taken up to the biggest level. We also provide support on the SDGs, which is an important part of governance and will be a very important part of governance for the next 18 years now. But even talking to government about a budget that is SDG friendly means that the government then has a framework to use for its discussion about what development is. So governance, our government and governance partnerships are quite broad. There is, of course, the whole area of sustaining peace, where the UN engages not just through its mechanisms in Geneva, like the UPR and periodic reporting on women's rights, children's rights, supporting the government to bring back recommendations and try to localize them, but also looking at how can we support the discussion around reconciliation, around ethnic groups and religious groups seeing eye to eye, young people understanding that the future of the country is one where everybody lives together and puts aside differences, where the historical past is addressed for the future, because I think a lot of emphasis has been put on the past, and that's very important. But addressing the past is actually about the future. And so the UN works to help the government and help civil society and private sector to lay those foundations. It's not our job to do them at all, but it is our job to help lay those foundations and to respond to requests for assistance in doing that within the limitations of our technical capacity and our small financial resources.
We spoke about the technical capacity, the limitations, the small financial resources. What are the main obstacles that are facing the implementation of the SDGs in Sri Lanka? What are the sort of roadblocks, the stumbling blocks that you've hit?
So I think we need to recognize that SDGs are very ambitious framework with a very short time frame. As you must know that compared to MDGs, which was developed by mostly technical specialists, SDGs was developed through the very participatory process with the people's participation. So that meant that we had a vast issues, 17 goals, as Una mentioned, and it is very challenging for any countries, even the developed countries, to achieve all of them. And our time frame is 15 years, and already the first few years is gone. So we need to recognize that's a very major challenge in Sri Lanka also.
Una?
And I think following up on that, you know, a country like Sri Lanka that does have public services that reach nearly all of the population is almost handicapped compared to some of its comparators, where you might have much higher infant mortality, for example, or you might have a much higher number of children out of school. Sri Lanka, in committing to, for example, reduce the number of children out of school and improve quality of education, actually has to go quite a lot further than a country where 15% of children don't go to school. If your infant mortality rates are already very low, you're then committing to addressing the infant mortality rates of a very limited number of children, for example, who are dying in the first 24 hours. not children who are dying in the first month or year, and you're reducing a small number of cases. So the SDGs become, in a way, more complicated the more developed service delivery is. But I think Sri Lanka has pockets of poverty. It has pockets where people are not best served by services, and an analysis of what the priorities are for Sri Lanka economically, socially, and in terms of addressing poverty really needs to look at which of the SDGs is most likely to reduce poverty, or which group of SDGs is most likely to reduce poverty in those areas where there are real pockets of poverty, pockets of deprivation, in order to bring those people to the same standards, to give the chances, as they say in football, and a level playing field for everybody.
You mentioned these pockets of poverty, of inequality. We've seen in Sri Lanka public service delivery is not the greatest. In a bid to sort of improve this, in 2015, Sri Lanka joined the Open Government Partnership, which also incorporates to a certain degree the implementation of the SDGs as well, specifically on Goal 16. In spite of that, though, in spite of the country signing on to these international conventions and movements and sort of trying to give out the right message, in terms of the actual legwork, there has been very little progress. For example, on the Open Government Partnership, on the right to information side, you've seen a fair amount of progress, but that was mainly procedural. But in terms of where actual legwork is required, there seems to be something that's holding it back. Do you get that sense?
I think, you've got this whole issue of supply and demand. And I think that the demand side for right to information, for example, comes from an educated middle class. When it comes to services, very often people, don't know what services they're entitled to. They don't know necessarily how to access the people who influence those services. And so this is not just about government delivering services. This is about the responsibility that we all have to enable people to understand what they're entitled to, or what standard of living they should have, and what should be needed to get them there. And I think this is where this SDG 17, which is about partnership, really moves beyond this perception that the SDGs belong to the UN or the SDGs belong to the governments of the world. The SDGs are actually a collective endeavor, and it's as much the responsibility of private sector to help fund and inform and educate and use their power as employers to go to those areas where people are most affected. And it's also part of the role of civil society to create demand for adequate services that are going to start leveling out that playing field.
Rachel, we were talking about the multiple stakeholders, and as Una quite correctly mentioned, the private sector has to be a major player and has to take a very proactive approach if these goals are to be achieved come 2030. In your work, how would you rate the response of the private sector? We know that in many Sri Lankan blue chip companies, they've set up sustainability divisions, they're carrying out various projects, but in terms of a percentage of the private sector, those blue chips are a minority. How do you reach out to small and medium enterprises, sort of instill sustainability thinking, make it part of their DNA?
Very challenging question, but I feel that some of the Sri Lankan companies, including the small ones, are quite ahead of the game. I witnessed this during the recent UNDP Youth Initiative, where some of the entrepreneurs were talking about their vision, and it really matches the social responsibility, environmental responsibility, and the profit-making part. So they don't have any contradiction within themselves, these three elements, if you like. And I feel that some of them, like Celine, who is the small, not small anymore maybe, but it started small, company that produced a lot of textile, the handloom stuff. They were very much into this kind of thinking and business model. So I believe that in a few years, probably a lot of companies will catch up this way of thinking.
You mentioned companies in that and young entrepreneurs who have sort of taken sustainability by the horns, taken the bull by the horns. But something that we see is that this tends to be very Colombo-centric, very Western province-centric. How do you bring in the rest of the country? Because it's not only Colombo that's the private sector. There's 24 other districts. How do you make it more inclusive?
I think one of the things that we've been doing far more systematically in recent years is talking to the different chambers of commerce here and outside the city in the provinces, but also looking at how to empower cooperatives and other groups of people who perhaps in the past were struggling as individuals to make money out of very small agricultural enterprises or small handicrafts, etc., and looking at how to empower groups of people to access markets. So we have work that's been done by ILO in the north where fruit is now being produced directly for export to the Middle East, and it's allowed cooperatives and producers in the north to access through their own value chain markets and empower people. But that comes along with education on what sustainable development means, and it comes along with responsibilities to hire people under conditions that are decent, that tries to stop the kind of dangerous migration that we've seen in the past. So linking again also the fact that those people need to stay in continuous education to keep improving their businesses. So yes, you could say it's a Colombo-centric conversation, but there are many of the big companies and many of the chambers who are also looking at how to move outside the city, because nobody wants Western Province to become, what do they call them, a sort of nation state within within one province. You want those bonuses of sustainable development to reach everybody.
The UNDP will be holding a Sustainable Business Forum in Singapore next week. What are you hoping will be the outcomes of this forum? What are the objectives?
So I think the forum is really looking at bringing together development practitioners from government sector, from UN sector, and those private sector development practitioners who perhaps have been sitting a little on the outside of the discussion around sustainable development, and looking at how to integrate everybody's vision for sustainable development, and looking at what would be, trillions of dollars that need to be spent to actually implement the sustainable development agenda, and saying, well, which part of this is funded by the government, which part of this is funded by ODA, and which part of this is funded through private sector activities and through modifying and changing all of our activities so that they all work towards the sustainable development goals that are most relevant to the country or countries that they're working in. So I think it's really about bringing people together to look at this big, ambitious 13-year agenda now and saying, how can we all work with a common set of objectives across a very complicated agenda and contribute to the financing of that, because it's a very costly platform.
One final question before I let both of you go. You mentioned a couple of times now how the SDGs are far more ambitious, far broader, far more sweeping than the Millennium Development Goals. Has this been tempered by realism? Is it pragmatic? is it realistically achievable by 2030, or will it be a case of shooting for the stars and falling on a cloud?
Well, I feel that when the MDGs came out, people were very skeptical too. I remember I was studying with the UN back then, feeling that, is it realistic? And I got that feedback from many government counterparts too. But 15 years later, when we look at the achievements, we have to be very impressed. I think we made a really good progress. So I believe SDGs also have a chance, and we need to give a chance for SDGs so that we have a platform to work on, and we can probably create a new kind of reality down the line.
And I don't think any government is being asked to achieve every single indicator and target of the SDGs. Countries are being asked to prioritize where there are the quickest gains and the fastest gains that will allow them to achieve this great universal mantra of leaving no one behind. And so each country really, as we go through the remaining years, will have to make choices about what they prioritize, unless, of course, someone does invent money trees wherein countries can possibly try to achieve everything. But I think that it has to be tempered with realistic planning, has to be planning across government, across civil society, across the public sector, with the whole of the UN working with governments around the world to achieve this ambitious agenda.
All right, so tempered with realism, but as you mentioned, Retsu, there was a lot of skepticism surrounding the MDGs when they came out as well. So maybe time will prove that the SDGs are the way to go. It is the way to go. It's just a matter of prioritizing. So will Sri Lanka get their priorities straight? Will we be able to get our priorities straight in achieving the SDGs? When will we see a holistic national policy document, something in writing from the government towards achieving the SDGs? Thank you very much, Una, and thank you very much, Ritsu, for coming on the program.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We'll see you again, same time, same place next week. This is Biz1st in Focus.